We're going to talk a little bit about wildfire risk assessment for grid resiliency, particularly in wildfires. And my coworker Eduardo yesterday kind of teed me up, if you remember way back when. And he talked a lot about this resiliency for earthquakes. And so what we've been doing over the last few months is really starting thinking about this for wildfires. And the reason it's really complicated, especially for grid resiliency, is because the grid and electrical components are both the target and the source. And so typically when we do wildfire risk assessments, we are exploring the fire propagation through the community, and we're looking at exposure. And our assets are not actually causing the ignitions. And so here in grid resiliency, we have portions of the grid that are actually causing ignitions. We have portions of the grid that are exposed to ignitions and being damaged. And then we have portions of the grid that are both, that when they are exposed to fire, they are causing more ignitions. And so from an academic perspective, that just means this is a really fun problem. But from an application point of view, this means that it becomes really complicated. And so I'm going to start this off by kind of introducing this framework. And I'm going to bring this up a few times throughout the presentation. And even when we're talking about poles, when we're talking about, the resilience of these poles and the survivability of these poles in a wildfire, we're doing it for a reason, right? We want to make sure that these poles aren't substantially damaged in a fire so that they don't fall over and block egress routes for evacuation for people. They don't block access for defensible action for firefighters. That they're not just pulling down power lines and causing ignitions if the lines are still on or if they're still live. And so, the role, it goes beyond just how do we protect the poles. It's for a reason, right? It's for the risk assessment of the community, and it's for the return of the community. So a lot of the risk assessment work that I do is thinking about the potential for recovery. We're not trying to limit damage to limit damage. We're trying to limit damage so that the community can start up again, so that we don't have a large economic burden on the community itself, and we can return to functionality. So we have the ignition potential of our electrical systems, and if we're going to calculate that, and there's been a lot of research on this, our inputs here are really the self-induced electrical ignitions, fragility functions for ignition potential for various components in our grid, but also, it's not just that in isolation. It's that coupled with weather, with vegetation around the assets itself or the components. We can take those ignitions, and then this is a lot of what I do, is then we can perform fire propagation pathways through and models through the wild land as well as through the built environment. To do that, we're also inputting weather, climate, vegetative fuels, urban fuels. We're looking at topology and topography because slope highly impacts the direction and the pathways of the fire itself. We'll take all of that, and then this is really where we're looking at the damage to our power systems. And so now we're looking at that kind of exposure of what is the exposure of our power systems components, and especially, the bigger assets, our substations. But then, we don't want to stop there, right? We want to be able to go into this power system restoration timeline, just as the Oregon Resilience Plan states, or the Resilient Washington State Initiative, or the SPUR Plan, depending on where you are located. But every state has their own plan for earthquake, restoration timelines, and so we should be able to use that for wildfire restoration timelines as well. If we want to mitigate, we can mitigate through planning actions. We can do vegetation management and hardening of our actual grid components. We have a lot of vendors in the room I was talking to yesterday that have some products on the hardening of the poles themselves. Vegetation management, a lot of you already do that on a lot of your distribution and transmission systems. But you can also do mitigation action through operations. And so that's through that islanding that Eduardo was talking about yesterday. It's through load shedding as well. And based on the performance objectives, right, that will kind of tell you how much you need to do. And so the goal, is that we are able to predict the demand of fire in different areas of the community and then across different communities themselves, so that we're able to know where do we have the highest likelihood of fire demand going through the community, where do we need the most mitigation, and then how can we do that systematically? Where do we start? That is always the biggest question that I get. So I'm going to bring this up a bunch throughout the presentation to kind of get us thinking about, it's bigger than just the poles. We're thinking about the whole system. We're thinking about the whole risk analysis of the community, as well as the functionality of that community socially and economically, so that it can recover faster. Okay, so I did say I would talk about poles and materials, so I will talk about that. And throughout, these are all pictures from actual fires that I do a lot of post-fire investigations, especially on homes and buildings and water systems, and these are all like pole collapses in actual fires. During the Camp Fire, there was a huge issue with power lines down and poles down for egress routes, but this also happened during the first picture. I didn't have a caption. That was the Alameda Drive fire in Southern Oregon in 2020. So when we talk about fire, we can't really talk about fire in isolation of wind. So in all of the events that are just splattered all over the media, this is more than just a fire demand in a community. It is a wind demand as well. In the Marshall Fire, in the Palisades Fire earlier this year, you had wind gusts of up to 100 miles an hour. In the Alameda Drive Fire in Southern Oregon in 2020, we had wind gusts of up to 40 miles per hour. In Lahaina, there was about 67 miles per hour. None of these wind speeds are unique to that area, right? Right outside Boulder County, Colorado, in Louisville, where that was heavily impacted, they actually test wind turbines outdoors, right? So that location of the country has very high winds, high enough to test wind turbines. And so this 100 miles an hour is normal for this area. The Palisades Fire occurred during the Santa Ana winds. The issue that's happening is that we are having these high winds during very dry conditions. All right, maybe we're done. Hope they're going somewhere nice. So it results in this. So when we're thinking about the fire impact to the community, we're often talking about wind-driven fire events. We're not talking about just regular fire events that might occur within the wildland. Here in Oregon, our fire season, often starts even as early as May, June. But when it becomes dangerous is at the end of August, beginning of September, when we have these very high easterly wind events. And when that is coupled with dry conditions, we have fires that get out of control. And so this Alameda Drive fire occurred during that time. It was over Labor Day, and that fire occurred at the same time as like 13 other fires throughout the state, all of them quite large. This past year, we had a lot of fires going on around Bend and Sisters and Oak Ridge, all around end of August, beginning of September, right? So I just want to like kind of, it's the wildfires, it's a wind and fire event. And so when we look at this, we can have our wind, impacting our poles, having them fall over. When they do fall over, we'll have, tension demands on the lines, pulling on the other poles, pushing them to fall over as well. And if we look at this, this is where I'm gonna insert some structural engineering. So here's our pole. All right, here's our wind coming at the pole, all right, and what the moment demand, all right, on the pole is, it looks something like this. So we have our largest at the bottom, all right? And the reason I'm mentioning that is because if you then have a fire, what else is at the bottom is your vegetation. And so if you have the largest structural loading demand on the bottom, right? And you couple that with vegetation on the bottom as well, right? This is what's heating up, and our timber material properties are degrading as the temperature is increasing. And so we have less resistance to the maximum demand, right? So this is all happening at the same time. All right, so what happens is, this is where I'm gonna kind of dig into some timber and fire mechanics, is when we heat timber, we often talk about the char, and timber does char, and char is great. It's a great insulator, but what we don't talk about is what's happening beyond the char. Right beyond the char, we have a layer of timber that has heated up to about 200 to 300 degrees Celsius. For the Canadians in the room, this is for you. We're using metric. We often talk about temperatures in Celsius in fire. And so the reason I'm mentioning this is because timber begins to lose substantial amount of strength and stiffness at around 100 degrees Celsius. So it's not just about the char, it's about the strength and the stiffness of the material itself degrading with temperature, right? And this is why we need the protection systems that you see with the vendors around the room. This is why we need all those protection systems at the bottom of the pole where the vegetation is and it's heating up, where our maximum loading demand is, right? And so char is a really great insulator. We're going to talk about that in a second. And so when timber chars, the material properties change. And so it actually does protect the timber that is beyond it. So if we were talking about a char rate, how fast is this piece of timber going to char? The timber that's further up towards the unexposed surface is going to char slower than the timber that's more exposed to the fire itself. And we've known this for a long time, and I have abundance of data on this if you would like to see. But the char actually protects and acts as like a fire protection for the uncharred timber. The char itself does shrink. So if we think about all those, I loved the talk yesterday about woodpeckers and the cross braces, and we don't want the woodpeckers, drilling holes right below those cross braces, where we have connections coming into our poles itself, the char is going to shrink, okay? So the connections to the pole itself might be compromised when the timber is charring. Right? And so then right beyond the char layer is what we call the pyrolysis zone. This is basically where the solid timber is being converted into gas. And so this is where the timber is decomposing, and the moisture of the timber is actually coming out the exposed surface as well as going into the unexposed timber, right? So the moisture is going both ways. And so we often don't consider that in our calculations of capacity, but we are losing moisture content as the timber chars, and that's why it shrinks, and that's why we have very little strength and stiffness. All right, so this is a lot of lines on a plot. Basically, these are different types of material properties, structural material properties for timber, in tension and compression, and in shear. And what I want you to take away from this is that within the first 100 degrees, right, so I think we all know, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. This is why this number is like key, where our strength reduces by about 35 to 75%, right? And this is not to bash timber. I think there's like a lot of applications for timber in a lot of different areas, and I do a ton of research on this. But the reason why this is important is because when we look at steel and concrete, at where that is degrading with strength and stiffness, that is more at 400, 300 degrees Celsius, right? So by the time we get to the point where concrete might start degrading strength and stiffness, the timber has charred. All right, so this is why we need protection systems, right? This is why we need to know where the fire is going to be. This is why we need to know where we should put which poles where, right? To make very informed decisions about the materials that we're using in the areas that we have various exposures. All right, the other point is that once timber chars, you don't unchar it. So if I heated up a piece of steel to 800 degrees Celsius, I then cooled, kept it at that for about 30 minutes or an hour, cooled it back down. It maintains about 95% of its ambient capacity, right? It kind of goes back to what it was. But you can't like unchar the timber, it's gone. And so that I think is the biggest point of why we have to protect the timber poles. There's a number of reasons to make these decisions, right? You have cost, you're like, this is what we call like a multi-point, optimization problem, is like you have cost, you have, the environmental considerations, you have fire, you have many other considerations to make. And so the more data you have to make those decisions, the better informed you can make them for specific areas of your community. All right, so the last point I'll talk about with fire specifically is that we all know that as we expose, anything, and this is material independent. I'm just showing a piece of timber here, but what I'm about to tell you is independent of material. As we expose a material to fire, the heat is going to propagate from the hot surface to the cold surface. But specifically in wildfires, the fire will move on. There's no more fuel burning around the pole. The fire has moved on. And you hit what we call the decay phase of the fire. But that equilibrium has not been met. And so heat continues to propagate into that section. So it's not just about the short duration that the pole has fire directly around it, but what's happening when the fire moves on, what happens during the decay phase of the fire. And so in timber specifically, right, the heat continues to conduct through, and sometimes what we've seen in building fires is it continues to char the timber. But in this case, it would continue to heat the timber beyond that 100 degrees Celsius mark, degrading the strength and stiffness of the timber, again, in that most critical region of the pole for structural capacity. Okay, so I'm going to briefly talk about some available materials for power poles, although that was really covered yesterday. And then I'm going to talk about a wildfire risk assessment that we did in Ashland, Oregon, to kind of give you an overview of what is kind of coming down the pipeline, out of Oregon State, and where we're kind of looking at this from a full community point of view. And so I found this on the internet, so it must be true. That this is one of the first poles that was built for, wooden poles that was built for telegraph use, to build a line between Baltimore and Washington, D.C. They produced, a bunch of poles, and this is in the 1840s. And then since then, we've been using wooden poles throughout the country. We use a lot of wood in our construction in this country, and I have nothing against that. We should use a lot of wood. We have awesome trees. Hopefully, many of you have seen that as you flew into Portland or you've driven around this area. Most of us are from, kind of highly wooded areas. We have awesome trees. They grow very straight in this area of the country. That's why we use them for construction. And they're cheap. It's super cheap. And so, but I think, just thinking about where do we put that? Where in the community are we putting that? And so you heard a lot yesterday about these different types of materials for utility poles, and I am not going to rehash any of that. There's also a lot of vendors around the room that could talk probably better than I could about a lot of these materials. But what I am going to talk about is I was starting to do some research into the testing standards. And so there's this new testing standard for wood utility poles, and it talks about, I have a typo. You gradually increase the temperature to 980 degrees Celsius, and you keep it there for 10 minutes, and then afterwards, while you're exposing the pole to this 2 meters per second wind speed for 4 hours, right? And so if we're thinking about the testing standards that we're using and then the communities that we're putting them in, is this the same, right? So our wind-driven fire events are producing wind speeds that are much larger than 2 meters per second. And so do we have to rethink that, right? You all are the people in the room to advocate for that the poles should be tested to something that should be commensurate with what they're being exposed to. I found this really awesome report from McWane Poles. I'm pointing to their booth over there, and of testing of ductile iron poles, but it wasn't the same testing standard. It was something else, right? And we deal with this in the building industry all the time. Of different materials in our buildings are tested to different standards or to different methodologies. And so how can we, think about like testing all of these poles to the same standard, to the same methodology, and have that be commensurate with what they are experiencing during these wind-driven fire events. Okay, inconsistent methodologies. Okay, so I did a lot of investigations after the LA fires. I'm just going to kind of flash some photos that we saw of like a substation that was completely burned through. But this is also what we saw. We saw a lot of these holes. And a lot of this is smoldering, right? So we need to, consider that in our designs and in what we're doing, right? So I know that, Stella Jones was talking about how they wrap down into the ground, right? And I think that's really important that we're wrapping our wood poles down into the ground, right? Where the smoldering could actually occur to prevent that from actually happening. Okay, so I'm flashing this back on the screen because we're going to start talking about this. And so if we want to, think about, where are our vulnerabilities in our communities? What infrastructure is most vulnerable in a wildfire? And what is the exposure of our infrastructure components? How can we think about reducing that exposure? How can we think about increasing that fire resistance capacity? This is kind of the flow chart that we keep kind of coming back to in our team. And so I'm going to show you an example. It's not going to include any ignition potential due to electrical systems because it's a little bit new. But it does kind of march through a risk analysis that we did in Ashland, Oregon. So what we did is we took a 5-kilometer buffer around the city of Ashland, Oregon, and we looked up where all of the ignition points have occurred ever. And so there's been 213 ignition locations around Ashland, Oregon. Fun story is 2 of them are from banana trucks. I don't think anyone else can say that, but I really love that. And so we took those ignition points and then we applied the climate and weather data from the Alameda Dry Fire in Southern Oregon in 2020. For those who don't know, the Alameda Dry Fire, and why I keep mentioning it, is because this is the most destructive wildfire in Oregon's history. 2,400 homes were completely burned down. The fire started in Ashland and traveled towards Phoenix and Talent. The fire path was very, very narrow. If anyone drives up and down I-5 in Southern Oregon, you can actually still see the burn scars today. I was just down there a few weeks ago, so I can promise you still see them. And it just ripped right through town, and it surprised everyone and caught everyone off guard. So we ran fire models for every single one of those 213 ignition locations. We then overlaid the pathways for all 213 ignition locations. And by overlaying those, we could actually look at what the burn probability is throughout the town of Ashland. So where do we have those overlays occurring the most? So we can begin to use burn probability as a marker and as a metric for risk. We can also calculate mean arrival time of the fires, okay? So what that tells us is how fast do those fires get to that location, right? So where you have the most potential for fire in your town might not be where the fastest location is for the fire in your town, right? So this kind of tells us about the potential for defensive action. Wildfires are pretty much the only hazard where we are relying on first responders to save our infrastructure, right? We're not asking our first responders to stand there and hold up a building in an earthquake or a hurricane or pump out water in a rainstorm, but in a fire, we are expecting our first responders to be there and defend our structures, right? And so mean arrival time tells us what's the possibility of them getting there. So we're still kind of kicking this around, but how do you even think about risk when it comes to wildfires? What does it actually mean? And so this is a definition from the UN. It's used by FEMA as well, as risk analysis requires an assessment of the likelihood and the potential impact. And so likelihood, we have that. We have burn probability. Potential impact, we don't really have that, but we could use hazard intensity as a kind of a way to measure that potential impact. And so in order to calculate that, what we did is we could use hazard intensity as mean arrival time. So, if the firefighters can't get there in time, if you have a low arrival time, a fast arrival time, that could be high impact, versus a longer arrival time where it gives more time for firefighters to get there, you could have lower impact. And we know that slower moving fires actually release more heat. So this is a plot that's often used by firefighters to think about the rate of spread. Rate of spread is on the y-axis. I know you can't read that. And then heat per unit area is on the x-axis. And if we look at short grass fires are up here in the upper left-hand corner. Chaparral, for any of us from Southern California, they know chaparral. Chaparral is extraordinarily combustible. That is what the Palisades as well as the Eaton fires were. These were chaparral fires. Fires rip through chaparral, and it's actually explosive. It just explodes all over the place. There is some in Southern Oregon too. And so this kind of tells firefighters what equipment to use, depending on the rate of spread and the heat intensity. So we thought, well, maybe we could do this in a community, because that is developed for the wildland. So in a community, our heat intensity is going to be based on the amount of vegetation around our assets, as well as the amount of built environment around our assets. Structures burn with energy about 10 times that of vegetation. So if we have an asset with a ton of homes are closely spaced around it, the intensity of the fire in that area is going to be much higher than if it just had vegetation around it. So what we did is we took all these assets throughout Ashland, substations, water tanks, schools, police stations, fire stations, the hospital. And we calculated we took a 100-meter buffer around that asset, which is about 3 city blocks, and we calculated the area of vegetation, and we calculated the area of buildings around each one of these. And then through that, this is the only slide with equations, I promise. We then calculated the fire intensity contribution from the vegetation through that, the output from our model. And then we calculated the fire intensity contribution from the urban environment by using an average heat release rate of a home times the area of the fuel in the buffer. And then we basically averaged it across the whole buffer, right, for every single asset. And so what we used for homes, and this is an average, there isn't a lot of data on this, is 140 kilowatts per meter squared. So I'm going to show you a few plots. So we're going to look at this in a few different ways. Here I have mean arrival time on the x-axis and the mean burn probability on the y-axis, right? And we can see the mean burn probability of all these assets is about the same, right? But if we look at where we have, high burn probability and fast arrival time, we have some schools and we have some water tanks, right? So that's one way of saying this is high risk, right? Those assets are very high risk. If we look at medium burn, we have some substations, the gray crosses are electrical power substations. They have medium burn probability and much slower arrival time. So we might be able to say like, oh, okay, this is good. Not very high risk. But we can look at this in another way. We can look at this as mean burn probability against heat per unit area, so fire intensity. All right, and we begin to see that some of the substations have very high heat per unit area around them, right? So if they're located in the center of town, then they might have a lot of homes around them, and they might be, threatened by those homes. If we look at rate of spread versus heat per unit area, and this is the same units as that other plot I was showing you that's used in the wild land, we can see that we do have some substations that have high heat per unit area and low rate of spread. Those are probably in the middle of the community. And we have some that have higher rate of spread and lower heat per unit area. And what this tells us, I can kind of skip that, is that how to mitigate, right? This is what tells us how to mitigate. If you have a high rate of spread, that means you have a lot of vegetation around you, right? The fire moves substantially faster in the wild land than it does in the middle of the community. So it's going to tell you what's the best bang for your buck in mitigation. So assets that have high rate of spread, you want to do a lot of vegetation management around them. Assets that have lower rate of spread, but high heat per unit area, they probably have a lot of homes around them. So if we're asking, where do we prioritize mitigation? How do we prioritize mitigation? And what do we prioritize in our mitigation? Right? We have to look at this from all these different perspectives to know where to even take that first step in trying to reduce the exposure.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah. That's a really great question. So all of these results and everything we've done so far is only exposure. So it's only the hazard itself. It's not the capacity of whatever the asset is to resist that exposure. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. Yeah. So this is like one of my last slides. So I just wanted to kind of flash this again. Thinking about wildfire risk assessment to communities, thinking about our poles, thinking about all of our other assets in our electrical grid, right? We have to be thinking about like, where do we put what? Where do we do our mitigation? What kind of mitigation is most effective in the community? How do we calculate the exposure of all of these assets and the potential for ignition of a lot of these assets as well? So one last shameless plug is that I am a fire researcher. Obviously, I just talked to you about this for 45 minutes. And we are building a fire lab at Oregon State University. We are breaking ground on December 10th. It will be built within 1 calendar year. Hopefully. It has to, otherwise the funding goes away. But we are looking for industry partners, right? So there are actually no fire labs at any university west of Michigan. There are no fire labs at any university in this country that can test timber, and we will be able to do both. We'll have a furnace. We'll also have a 3 megawatt hood, so an open burn area, 3 megawatts. You can burn like a 12 by 12 garden shed or a car, depending on what you're into. But we want to partner with industry. We want to, create opportunities. We are not planning on doing certification testing, but we are planning on doing research. So if you have ideas about research, you have new products coming out, you want to do research, you want to partner with a university to do that research, we would love to partner with you. So come find me and chat with me. And thank you very much.